Hello, my name is Jonathan Lyon and I'm a Program Manager in Microsoft's Identity and Network Access Engineering team. In this session, I'm going to demonstrate why independent software vendors and developers should integrate their applications with Microsoft's Identity and Microsoft Graph. This will be a high-level presentation of the business value and integration options the Microsoft Identity platform provides. We'll also look at how easy it is to integrate your applications with the platform. So what does the Microsoft Identity platform consist of? Well, you have one portal to register all your applications, one set of authentication libraries for building web, mobile, desktop apps with all your favourite programming languages. There's a single endpoint that is standards compliant that can sign in any Microsoft Identity. It also allows compatibility with third-party libraries. You also get to secure access to APIs, from Microsoft's APIs such as the Microsoft Graph and Azure API to your own APIs that you're building. This gives you the ability to authenticate any Microsoft identity, including work and school accounts, Microsoft personal accounts that are used for things like Xbox and Outlook.com, and your application can sign in external users such as customers and partners using social identities like LinkedIn and Facebook, as well as local accounts for those that don't have a social identity. And our platform supports open industry standards. So if you've already got an application today that's using, say, SAML or OAuth, it's going to be very straightforward to you to connect your application. So why integrate with the Microsoft Identity platform? Well, really there's 5 main benefits. The first is to reduce sign-in friction for both you, as the ISV developer, and for your customer. By no longer managing identities and authentication within your app, you will save time and can focus on your core product. This also lowers the cost of development. There's no building of infrastructure to store usernames and passwords. Your users will have a better experience, allowing them to use their own preferred identity to sign into their applications. And single sign-on is the key thing that our customers are asking for. They want a single identity that is provided by their organization, and they can leverage that identity across all the applications and services they use. Enhanced security. How many of you that have apps already today where you store a username and password have had your customers recently ask you for multi-factor authentication? How many of those customers are asking you about security and starting to make demands on how your app is secured? By using the Microsoft Identity platform, you and your customers will cover a large suite of security capabilities without actually making much change to your application. Because they own the identity, they can leverage the security capabilities they have already purchased as part of their Azure or Office 365 licensing. You'll also be able to leverage the Microsoft Cloud. I will cover this more often in a bit with the Microsoft Graph API, but basically you can leverage and integrate Office 365 capabilities within your application. We then can look at complying with IT. Because IT are now in control of your app, which users can use it, how they can use it with security controls, they can ensure that your app matches their IT compliance. And then the last point, of course, is coming to integration. And this is a key one for yourselves. It's very, very easy to integrate. And during this session, I'll show you the wealth of resources that makes integration easy. This is the one salesy slide I promise, and I won't go through each of these numbers, but it's safe to say we have a lot of customers, which means there's a very good chance your customers are already using Azure AD. So let's put some of these impressive numbers into a bit of context. Everyone you know that uses Office 365 has Azure Active Directory already in place. Everyone that uses Azure has Azure Active Directory. So what if your customers don't use either of those? Well, there's still a good chance they're already using Azure Active Directory, When we look at our usage numbers and take out the Microsoft first-party products, we have large numbers of Amazon Web Services and Google customers using Azure AD as their identity provider for those products. And we also have thousands of third-party SaaS applications already using Azure Active Directory as an identity provider. So there really is a good chance that your customers are using this. When you look at stuff like Microsoft Teams, for example, with the recent COVID situation, Teams usage now is in the millions of daily active users. All of those users are using Azure Active Directory. So they will be able to use single sign-on with your application. So let's just talk quickly about Azure Active Directory. So typically Azure Active Directory comes in two forms. One is Azure Active Directory Cloud and the other is hybrid. So Azure Active Directory Cloud is where an organization has a cloud-first approach. All their identities are in Azure Active Directory and they use that throughout their life cycle. So they can have third-party HR apps such as Workday automatically provisioning users from their Workday platform. IT can then see those users, they can assign permissions, group memberships, provide access to applications and the demands of the business. A hybrid model is very similar, but the difference is it starts from on-prem, where an organization has Active Directory, which we're all very familiar with, and they synchronize those identities up into the cloud. Again, they can still use products like Workday for automatic provisioning, and they can then still use Azure Active Directory for authentication for those cloud-based applications like Office 365, Salesforce, Dropbox. So it really provides a very simple mechanism for organizations to have single sign-on both on-premise and in the cloud. One identity that can access everything. That identity lifecycle can be managed by a third-party solution. IT can put security controls around that identity and the applications and resources it works on. So it provides a true enterprise identity platform. And basically, we can ensure that business processes are always up to date, user information is correct, permissions are correct. So it provides a secure platform for controlling access to valuable data and resources. A part of Active Directory, Azure Active Directory, is external identities. And this is one of the most commonly asked questions we get from developers is, what is external identities? What is B2C? What is B2B? And which of those should I be using for my app? So Microsoft Azure Active Directory External Identities is a set of capabilities that lets you share your resources or apps with users outside of your organization. And there are two main reasons why you might need to connect with external users. And this links us nicely to the B2B, B2C piece. So sharing Azure Active Directory apps and resources for collaboration. In this scenario, you can invite external users into your tenant, your Azure Active Directory, as guest users that you can then assign permissions while letting them still come in using their existing credentials. And I'll show an example of this in a second. We've now even added capabilities for self-service sign-up and federation flows, so you can actually start providing a better experience for external users requesting access to your apps and resources. This is very much a B2B or business-to-business scenario. The other scenario is where you want to scale your apps to consumers, customers and citizens. And this is the Azure AD B2C or business to consumer. If you're creating consumer-facing apps, you can use Azure AD as your directory and identity system for consumers who can then sign in with the identity they've already established. For example, LinkedIn or Facebook. You can fully customize the control of the user experience for them signing up to access the application, signing into the application, and even managing their user profile. The difference here is with Azure Active Directory, when you build an application, you're not providing an identity store. You are basically setting your application to work with Azure Active Directory, and therefore the authentication all happens there. With B2C, what we're doing is we're providing you an identity platform and a B2C tenant. And what happens there is you then decide which identity providers you want to federate with. So when I come to access your application as a consumer, I would come and I would sign up to use your service. And when I do that, you can provide a number of identity providers I can select from, and I can go, oh, I already have a Facebook, so I will use that one. And then you basically store a bit of information around that user that you can leverage within your application. But the authentication always happens with Facebook. I hit your B2C instance, that redirects to Facebook, that authenticates me, brings me back to B2C, and then into your application. Now, Azure Active Directory is licensed per user. There's a free tier and then a couple of premium tiers. And you'll find most of your customers have already got premium capabilities as part of their Office 365 or M365 licensing. For external identities, we have a single billing model, which is based on monthly active users. This is the count. This is the count of unique users with authentication activity within a calendar month. So let's look at that B2B example in a little bit more detail, just to make sure we're clear on that scenario. Here we have a user from Fabrikam, and they are in their own tenant. We also have the Contoso tenant, and they have an application that is a SaaS application that they've been using, but they need a guest from Fabrikam to be able to use that application. Maybe it's a contractor, or maybe they're partnering on an initiative. What Contoso can do is invite that user as a guest, and then they can set permissions to say that guest user can access the application. In that scenario, the Fabrikam user uses their Fabrikam credentials for authentication, but authorization happens in Contoso. So why is this important? Well, when you're developing applications, this will be a very common scenario within your customers. So it's worth being aware that this will happen. Now, when your application gets an authentication token from Contoso, it'll say, here's a Contoso user, here's some information, and they're authenticated, they can use your app. When a Fabrikam guest user comes and accesses your application, it's exactly the same process. As far as you're concerned, it's a user coming from Contoso. You don't need to know that they've authenticated from Fabrikam, because your application is licensed to Contoso and Contoso are using it. The other reason we mention B2B is because sometimes developers fall in a trap of spooling up an Azure Active Directory tenant and inviting lots of different customers to that tenant and using that as the identity for their application. And that's not its intention. So when we're trying to decide whether it's Azure AD or B2C, there's really a key question to ask, and that is, who is your audience? Who are the people accessing your app, and who are they acting as? If they're a consumer, a customer, perhaps you don't even know they exist yet, that's very much a B2C scenario. If you're building an application for a SMB, small to medium-sized business, or an enterprise organization, they would have Azure Active Directory. So you would leverage Azure Active Directory as the identity platform. So now let's look at some scenarios and what's the right solution for them. So this is the first one. I want to provide secure, seamless access with single sign-on to my employees using their business IDs. So this is what we commonly known as a line of business application. It's a single tenanted app. It's built for a organization and they will use it. And the right identity solution for this is Azure Active Directory. This way they can use their corporate IDs to access the application and get that single sign-on. As you can see from the slide, They can still leverage B2B and invite guests in and give them access to the application, but it's a single tenant app built for that organization. So the next scenario is very similar. I want single sign-on, but I'm building a SaaS application, and it's for small to medium-sized businesses, enterprises, and I want them to use their own corporate credentials, their business IDs to access the application. Again, this is where Azure Active Directory sits in. You can configure your application to use Azure AD, and no matter what Azure Active Directory comes in, they can authenticate and give you an ID and an access token. You will then do the authorization to say, yes, they're licensed, or yes, they're allowed in to do the application, but it means you don't need to manage the identities, you don't need to manage usernames and passwords. You can simply let the authentication happen within Azure Active Directory. You still get to see who the user is. You will get an ID token as part of that authentication process, which will give you valuable information like their name, their user principal name, their email address, the tenant they came from, for example. So in this scenario, I want to provide simple, reliable and secure single sign-on to customer-facing apps, social accounts, and potentially even business IDs. So here I have an application, and I don't know who my users are potentially. They're more general public. This is where B2C sits in. I can create customized user flows, including a sign-up process where they can come and they can register for an account. And when they do that, they can select the identity that they want to use to authenticate with that application. And there's a multitude of them available. Google, Facebook, LinkedIn, Amazon, Twitter, the list goes on. And you can even use pretty much any identity provider out there that uses OpenID as a protocol standard. If they don't have any identities, because B2C is an identity platform in its own right, you can also create local users. So therefore they could create a local B2C account. Now that does mean you store the username and password within B2C, but B2C out of the box provides a self-service password reset and profile editing features. So you can provide a mechanism for them to manage their account. You can also put security controls in. So if you want to force MFA on your app, you can do that with B2C. Bearing in mind, with the Azure Active Directory, you put in the onus on the customers to configure their MFA on the applications that they want to secure and the conditions they want to secure. But I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail next. And then the final scenario is all of the above. I want my apps to be accessed by customers, partners, and also employees. That's not a problem at all, because you can actually use Azure Active Directory and B2C side by side. So in this scenario, we have Woodgrove Groceries. We have a simple sign-up page here where we've got three personas. One is, I'm an individual customer. I want to go online, order my groceries for home delivery. In this scenario, you don't know who I am. So I will sign up and I can then choose the identity provider of my choice to do the authentication. So for example, LinkedIn or Facebook. But what if there's a business that comes in? Maybe they want to order a load of fruit for fruit bowls around the office, and they're doing it on behalf of their company. Again, B2C could be set up to work with those corporate identities. So they could actually come in, they could sign up to B2C and use their Azure Active Directory to provide single sign-on as a business customer, and then they can order their fruit for the office. Then we come to the partner situation. So these are the suppliers, the farmers that are providing the produce. You might need to give them access to the back-end side of the application, so they can actually help with stock and orders processing. Here's where, if they've got Azure Active Directory, you could set up a B2B relationship and allow them to sign in using their corporate credentials as a business partner. So really, it doesn't matter what your scenario is, Azure Active Directory and the Microsoft Identity Platform can cater for it. So let's look now at how your app can be integrated with Azure Active Directory. As I mentioned earlier, our platform supports open industry standards. So if you've already got an existing application and it's using SAML or OAuth, it's really straightforward to connect your application with very little changes. If you're building a new application, then we highly recommend looking at OpenID and OAuth. It's the latest standard in authentication protocols. It has a simpler model for authentication, which means it's easier for customers to onboard. When you look at SAML, you have to share signing certificates and URLs in order to get SAML working as a relationship. With OpenID Connect, you don't have to do that, so it's easier for customers to onboard. You can also, with OpenID and OAuth, leverage APIs, including your own and third party, such as the Microsoft Graph. But of course, the choice is yours. We support both protocol standards. With our Microsoft Authentication Libraries, often referred to as MSOL, we've made adding authentication into your apps really easy. We provide documentation, videos, reference code, samples and walkthroughs for a wide range of languages. So no matter what your application is built on, you should be able to get integration into Azure AD up and running really quickly. This brings us to the Microsoft Graph. The Microsoft Graph allows your application to integrate and leverage capabilities within your customers' Azure, Microsoft 365 or Office 365 environments. With the Graph API, you can build custom solutions which both leverage your app's data and resources as well as your customers. To give you some examples here, we can access data such as accessing the user's OneDrive on their behalf, accessing their mailbox to look for email. You can traverse data, so sending data between their platform and your application. Access insights such as who is my manager? What are the last 5 Word documents I've been working on? So you can actually start bringing a rich context. And if you're stuck for ideas around this, start thinking about some of the simpler tasks you do. Does your application send notifications, like sending an email? Potentially, if you're doing that, you have an SMTP relay server, or you've purchased a third-party service using something like SendGrid. With the Graph, you could actually say, I'm going to send an email using that user's mailbox. Send it as that user rather than a service account. So you can actually start building some rich context. If you want to integrate your application into Microsoft Teams, you could actually have your application create a Teams channel and post data and insights there. And of course, you can build applications such as a bot that can integrate with Teams and your application, so it works vice versa. The best way to think of the Microsoft Graph is it's an API gateway that unifies the many APIs that Microsoft provides. So no matter what product or service, we're very, very API driven, and the Graph is your gateway to that. So once you've set up your permissions for the Graph, and these are the permissions that you want on the behalf of the user. So let's say you want to access my OneDrive. The next part is those permissions have to be consented to. So when you register your application in Azure AD, you'll specify the permissions and the context you need. When the user or the IT Pro authenticates for your application for the first time, they'll be presented with a consent form showing the permissions your application is requesting and the details of what that means. Some permissions, such as read your profile, can be accepted by the user. Other permissions need to be approved by an IT admin or an IT Pro. You'll also be, if you are an IT Pro, you'll also be given the option to accept the permissions on behalf of the whole organisation, so no one else will see the prompt. If your application does require admin approval, perhaps you need some elevated permissions to do something within the customer's organization, it's recommended as part of your onboarding instructions you get an admin from the customer to be the first user to log in or to go into the Azure portal and pre-approval, pre-consent to those permissions. If you've not come across the Microsoft Graph before, we have a tool called the Graph Explorer, and I've put the URL on the slide here. This can either be connected to an Office 365 tenant you already have, or you can use the sample one that's already connected to the Graph Explorer. But this allows you to see the current capabilities of the Microsoft Graph and also some preview beta capabilities. And you can actually use this as a playground by asking the Graph certain queries and seeing the type of data and insights you can get back. So let's now look at how quick and easy it is to get your application up and running. So first we need to register our application. This registration serves as the main configuration linkage between the Microsoft Identity Platform and your app. So here we're going to be using a single page JavaScript application. So we just need to configure that. So let's get this started. So we'll be in the Azure Active Directory portal. We go to app registrations and we'll create a new app registration. We'll give it a name and then we can define whether this is a single tenant app, a multi-tenant app, which means any Azure Active Directory can authenticate for this app, or multi-tenant and Microsoft personal accounts. And that's it. Once we've registered it, we'll add a platform and we're going to say this is a single page application and we'll put in our redirect URL. So in this scenario, localhost 3000 because it's just an app running locally. And that's it. We've got our application registered. So the next step is configuring the application. So what we need to do here is we've got our application and I'm going to provide some sample links where you get those. And then we're going to make just two changes. So this sample app is using MSAL.js. We need to add the client ID or application ID, the redirect URL, and the authority. As you can see here, we can see in our app registration the app ID. So we'll put that in our code there. And then next we're going to add the graph endpoints we want to use. Now normally these are always the same, which is graph.microsoft.com. That's for our commercial and public cloud platforms. If you're building something for a sovereign cloud, such as China or the US government, there are different endpoints for those. The last step now is we need to run our application. We'll use npm install to install dependencies and then npm start to run the app locally on the dev server. Once the dev server is up and running, we'll open a browser to localhost 3000 to see the app. Now the app will ask the user to sign in. This will then need user consent because it's the first time they've signed in. And as I mentioned, administrators can pre-approve consent. Sign in originally only asks for a signed in user. Configured policies like MFA and conditional access will also apply during this process, and I'll talk about that in a bit. Once signed in, we can fetch our user profile. So note there's no additional consent required. Then when we require access to the mailbox, since the user hasn't consented to that, allow the application to read their inbox previously, they'll be asked at this point the scope and permission that's required. This is called incremental consent. Note, we didn't configure in our app registration in Azure AD that mail.read permission, but we asked the user when we needed to. This sort of incremental or dynamic consent enables scenarios where developers can do least privilege. So rather than asking everything all up front, you run the user with the least privilege for as long as possible. and request new permissions only when they're needed. And that's it. We have got an application up and running. And at the end of the deck, there'll be some links to where you can get access to these samples. But it literally is, when you're using the MSAL libraries, just switching out an app ID and client ID, getting your reply URL, and then you're up and running. So once you've got your application up and running and using Azure Active Directory, the next step is to add it to the Azure AD App Gallery. What the Azure AD App Gallery does is it's a mechanism for your customers to be able to onboard your application. They can see what permissions that you want to access, and I'll show you what that looks like in a minute. So we have a really simple form where you submit the application that you've built, and then in a short period of time we will get that added to the gallery. So once it's listed in the gallery, IT admins can discover your application within the Azure portal. This can help IT admins easily deploy your app across the company for a specific set of users and groups. So here we are, we're in the Azure portal, we've gone into Enterprise Apps, and we can now browse and search that gallery for your application. Once I've installed the application, I can then go through processes to set up the application for my environment. Now, if I don't alter any of these settings, users can just start using your app with their credentials. But what I can do as an IT pro is I can define and assign users and groups that I want to access the application. I can then enable security controls using conditional access, for example, turning on multi-factor authentication when the application is being used outside of the office. I can also turn on things like self-service, so I can allow my users to request access to the application and go for a workflow where somebody can approve it, they'll get added to the users and groups, and then they can start accessing that application. I can also do automatic provisioning as well, and I'll talk about this in more detail in a minute. Once the application has been onboarded by the IT Pro, users can discover the application via the Office 365 App Launcher, the Office 365 App Gallery, and also the My Apps portal. And your app becomes a similar experience to all the Microsoft first-party apps. It gets listed next to Outlook, Word, Excel as an application that the organization use. So there's no need to send out emails saying, can you bookmark this URL or add this to your favorites, save it to your desktop. The application becomes part of their ecosystem. Now, as an admin, I could have seen the permissions up front that your application requires, and I could have pre-approved those so users don't get that consent experience as well. Customers have security as one of their core priorities. I'm sure each of you have had customer conversations where they've said your app needs to support MFA. And then you have to work out how you can build that into your identity solution, or perhaps purchase a third-party product to do it. So why build or buy those capabilities for your app? The answer is you shouldn't. When you integrate and build with our identity platform, you're able to protect your application and users more effectively by allowing your customers to leverage the capabilities within their Azure AD. So what do we mean by this? Well, when your customers sign in with their Azure AD account, they get the security benefits and access controls they know and are already using. They can extend their Azure AD security benefits to your application. So instead of adding code to your app that enables MFA or conditional access or any other advanced security features, our identity platform can provide these to your end customers on your behalf. It can help your application comply with their IT policies. And when we talk to enterprise customers and SMB customers, they want and need applications that comply with their IT policies, their company policies. The first way we can secure your application with Azure AD is secure authentication methods. To start with, they can use MFA using authenticator apps, SMS, or voice call. MFA can prevent 99.9% of identity attacks because it doesn't matter if the password's compromised, you need that second factor. Secondly, and very popular at the moment, they can use passwordless authentication. Passwords are the biggest vulnerability, partly because they are the target of most attacks we see today. 81% of all attacks were the result of weak or compromised credentials. But there's hope. Your customers can utilize passwordless technologies using Windows Hello, part of Windows 10, using biometrics such as facial recognition or fingerprint. They can use the Microsoft Authenticator app or use a FIDO security key like the YubiKey to authenticate without ever entering credentials. And then thirdly, we also continue to innovate around cloud-powered solutions like Azure AD password protection to help you secure your users' credentials. It may come as no surprise that users reuse passwords or worse, set standard passwords all the time. The bad news is hackers know this too, and according to our data, exploit this vulnerability all the time. With Azure AD password protection, we help protect those identities in two ways. One, banning commonly used passwords that we see all the time. We also allow customers to define a custom banned password list. And the second is Smart Lockout, which gives businesses the ability to define policies around how many times a wrong password can be entered before locking the user out. We then have conditional access. And conditional access is our way to help customers implement a zero trust security strategy. Conditional access is an intelligent policy that allows you to define conditions for how users authenticate and gain access to your apps and data. It allows your customers to have a trust nothing, verify everything approach. With conditional access, you can set these policies up that can use criteria like the user's the who, the device and client app, the how, the location, the where, and based on those, make a decision on how they can access the workload, the app. So let's look at a quick example. You've built a SaaS application which allows me to use my Azure Active Directory. It has sensitive data. So I could say if I'm in the office on a domain joined machine, I can access the application straight away. If I'm on a domain joined machine out of the office, I'll create a rule that says I just want MFA to be in place, just to make sure the user is the person in front of the keyboard. Alternatively, if somebody tries to access the app from a personal device, I will block access and they can't access the application at all. But you see how it allows your customers to granularly define how they want to use the app. And you don't have to do anything. They're in control of it and they have the tools and capabilities to provide that functionality. Additionally, we also feed in data from our intelligent security graph. This brings security signals like user behavior, location, state of device, application being accessed, and provides a risk score for user and sign-in. These are all analysed. Using machine learning, the signal is detailedly analysed and appropriate policies enforced, such as allow, limit, force a password reset, block, request additional verification. So if we see anything suspicious happening around that identity or that device, when they come to access the app, we can raise that risk level and enforce a control around that. So one of the things that we typically get asked is, if Azure Active Directory doesn't provide me as a developer an identity store, how do I manage users within my application? How do I profile? How do I set roles? Those sort of controls. So right now, if you use a user store or maybe a database, maybe you're using SQL to store your users inside your application, you provision those when you onboard a new customer. And typically what we see is very common is it's a CSV file, an Excel spreadsheet. it's a manual script, or maybe you've even built a custom automated solution. Azure Active Directory provides automated user provisioning or deprovisioning for your application. With Azure Active Directory, we support SCIM. SCIM is the System for Cross-Domain Identity Management and is an industry standard for automating the exchange of user identity information. Using SCIM, you can deploy a REST SCIM endpoint within your application, and that will send data to Azure Active Directory. Azure Active Directory will send data via JSON to that endpoint. You can then do whatever you want with that data. Store it in a SQL database like you might be today. So you can then assign licenses or roles or customer information. And as changes to those users in the source tenant happen, your endpoint will receive a JSON file with that update and those changes. And again, you decide what you want to do with those. It's an open industry standard. This isn't something that Microsoft's built. It's built on modern standards, REST and JSON. There's a defined schema, and this allows you to quickly and easily get those users in. So if your application today needs to know about users before they sign in, this is a great capability for you to be able to do that. We have sample code, we have a sample SCIM endpoint that you can download. So it's a very quick and easy way to get automated provisioning up and running. So your next steps to consider. First is user authentication libraries for securing sign-in for your apps. Have a look at the MSAL libraries, explore our quick starts, and see how quick and easy it is to be able to protect your own applications and APIs. Once you've got that bit, have a look at the Microsoft Graph. See what capabilities you're doing today, which you could potentially leverage the Graph for, but also look at what you could provide in the future with closer integration with Microsoft products. And I'll leave you with these resources. Here are access to all our documentation and samples, like the one I showed earlier today. And again, just want to thank you for your time. Hope the session was useful.